If you believe in the power of love, subscribe to Bear Tales for more heart-touching stories. Don't forget to comment your thoughts, because every love story deserves to be felt and shared.
After being reborn, I made sure to avoid every single encounter with Ryan Sullivan. This time he was reassigned to the Southern Military District. While I applied to Northwestern University, he submitted our marriage application, but I secretly took it back. He purchased a marital home over there, yet I deliberately chose to settle in the North. All of this was because in my past life his white moonlight Olivia Carter had remained single for him her entire life. He felt indebted to her, so behind my back
If you believe in the
secretly
power of
adopted
love,
a child with her. Even as he
subscribe to
grew
Bear
old, my own
Tales for
son
more
and I were
heart-touching
eventually moved by
stories.
their so-called
Don't forget
touching
to
love
comment your
story, and in the
thoughts,
end we all
because
became
every
one big
love story
family. The moment
deserves
I
to be
took back
felt
the
and
marriage
shared.
application, I
After
finally
20
let out a
years of
sigh
a
of
loveless
relief. No
marriage,
one knew that
I
I had been reborn
unexpectedly
at the
got a
very
second
last
chance
moment.
when I was
Before the
reborn.
application was
I found
officially
myself
submitted,
in the
I rushed
middle of
over and
divorcing
retrieved
Jack.
it using the
The reason?
excuse that there was
He
an error in the
secretly brought
family
his
and information the
ex-girlfriend
clerk
Jenna
looked at
Monroe
me with
into the company and promoted her
confusion. You
to the
submitted
position
this
of financial
application this
director
morning,
without
and now you're
following
taking
any
it back in
standard
the afternoon.
procedures.
Are you calling
That
off the
caused the
wedding, not
most
wanting to
intense
create
argument we'd
unnecessary
ever
trouble?
had,
I simply
and
shook
after
my
he
head. There was
stormed
a
out, I
mistake in
ran
the
straight to the
information. He'll
hospital
correct
and
it and bring
terminated
it
the
back. Only
pregnancy.
then did the
When
clerk
I
relax
opened my
and
eyes
tell me to
again, I saw
resubmit
the
it once I
familiar
had
wall
fixed the
calendar
error.
and
I
realized
nodded,
I had
walked out,
returned
and
to
immediately tossed the
1988.
marriage
With my
application
head
into
still
the
heavy
trash.
and
In this
aching, I
lifetime,
staggered
Ryan
out of the
Sullivan and I
bedroom.
would never get
The living
married.
room was filled with the
In my past
overwhelming
life,
smell of
although he had
cigarettes.
submitted the marriage
Jack was
application, his
slouched lazily
attitude
on the
toward me
sofa,
became
his
colder
long
and
legs
colder. I
resting on
thought
the
that was
coffee
just his
table,
personality,
puffing
and
on
didn't
one
think much
cigarette
of it. I
after
never
another.
imagined that it
The
wasn't
smoke
until I was
curled
on my
between his
deathbed that I
fingers.
would finally learn the
Maybe it was
truth.
the
He had always had
sensitivity of
Olivia
pregnancy
Carter
or
by his
simply
side.
being
She was
fed
his
up with the
white
same
moonlight,
smell
his
for
true love.
years,
She had
but I
never
suddenly felt
married waiting
nauseous.
for him all her
Hearing
life.
me
And in the
retching,
year
Jack turned
Ryan
his head
turned
to glance
40,
at
he was
me,
finally
then
moved
slowly
by her
got up and
devotion
walked
and
over. His sharp
adopted a
features
daughter
were
with
as
her. Even
defined
my
as
own
ever,
son was
yet he
touched by
never
their
put out the
so-called
cigarette
pure
in his
love and
hand.
secretly kept
I
in
threw up
contact
until
with them
nothing
behind
but
my
bile
back, if
remained,
not for my
rinsed
son
my mouth, and
accidentally
looked up
letting it
into the
slip while
mirror.
I was dying,
The
saying that
reflection
now his
staring
father
back
and
at me was
Olivia
young,
had
so
finally
young
made
that
it
for a
through all the
moment I was
hardships. I
dazed.
would have
He
remained in
was
the
the
dark
hottest
forever.
time of
It
the
was
year
only
in
then that I
Canton.
realized
The
my
balcony
entire
was
life had been
stifling
a
without a
joke, so that
breeze.
was why Ryan had
Jack
always
leaned
been so
lazily against
distant.
the
That
railing,
was why he
looking
was constantly
completely
being
unbothered.
reassigned. Every single transfer was arranged so that we would be as far apart as possible. We were married for 60 years, but if I counted the actual days we spent together, it probably wouldn't even add up to 1 year. When I nearly died giving birth, he wasn't there. When our child fell sick in the middle of the night, I carried him through the pouring rain for 3 hours before I found a doctor. Even when both of our parents passed away, he was still nowhere to be found. But on the other hand, wherever he went, Olivia Carter was always by his side. She started out as an ordinary nurse and eventually became his personal doctor. Ryan felt indebted to her for her unwavering devotion, so he silently accepted the fact that they adopted a child together. He also silently accepted the fact that her child called him dad. Even my own son wished for my death just so that these two star-crossed lovers could finally be together. When I returned home, I looked at the old worn-out house, my expression complicated. In my past life, in just 1 month, Ryan and I had gotten married here. After our wedding, he was reassigned to the Southern Military District. I wanted to go with him, but he said the conditions there were too harsh and persuaded me to stay behind, and so I ended up living here for 30 years. What I didn't know at the time was that less than 6 months after Ryan's transfer, Olivia Carter also moved there. From that moment on, the two of them became entangled in each other's lives for the rest of their days. The most ridiculous part: one used to worry that he had no one to take care of him while he was away. I had wanted to be by his side, but every single time he rejected me, and every single time he gave me the same excuse: our parents and our child need someone to be with them. And so while he had his soulmate accompanying him wherever he went, I spent my entire life trapped by him back in this small confined world. I returned home, but Ryan Sullivan had yet to come back. As soon as I entered the house, I went straight to my room and pulled open the bottommost drawer, where I found my acceptance letter. In my past life, because Ryan was reassigned to the Southern Military District right after our marriage, and because my mother-in-law suddenly fainted for no apparent reason a month later, combined with the fact that I had just become pregnant, I gave up my opportunity to attend Northwestern University. That regret had stayed with me my entire life. I ran my fingers over the acceptance letter, staring at my name and the bright red school seal printed on it, feeling a lump rise in my throat. I remembered how in my past life, when I was already on my deathbed, Olivia Carter had come to see me with my son. As if she already knew I wouldn't last much longer, she started visiting me daily, but when no one else was around, the kind and gentle expression she usually wore was stripped away, revealing her true face. The words she spoke stabbed straight into my heart. So what if your father held the title of wife, the one who was by Ryan's side all these years, was me. You were nothing more than a tool to bear his child and a free caretaker for the elders. I should really thank you for giving me such a wonderful son. She rambled on and on, while the most pathetic part was that I no longer even had the strength to curse her. I had to watch as my own son treated her like his real mother, the two of them playing out a perfect picture of maternal love and filial piety before my eyes. Even when I was finally at the point of complete despair, my son let out a sigh of relief and said, "Olivia has finally made it through all these years." I shook my head carefully, putting away my acceptance letter. The past was irreversible. While preparing dinner, Ryan finally returned home looking utterly exhausted. His clothes were damp, and at that moment a sudden realization hit me. On this very day in my past life I had been overjoyed, because I knew Ryan had submitted our marriage application. To celebrate, I had gone out and bought a variety of ingredients, eagerly waiting for him to come home so we could celebrate together. But I had waited and waited, and he only returned very late, drenched from head to toe. At the time I had been worried and asked him what had happened, but Ryan had simply responded indifferently, refusing to say a word. Later I learned the truth. Olivia Carter had somehow fallen into the river, and it was Ryan who had saved her. Thinking back on it now, I could already guess what had really happened. Olivia must have found out that Ryan had submitted the marriage application that day, and in her despair she had either lost hope or tried to use her life to force his hand. That would explain why Ryan had been so cold to me that night. In my past life he must have blamed Olivia's near drowning on me. But how was I at fault? He was the one who had proposed marriage, he was the one who had filled out the application, he was the one who had promised to stay with me for life, and yet in the end it was as if I had become the villain who broke up a pair of lovers. Liked Ryan, and when someone once tried to introduce me to another potential match, Ryan's parents quickly intervened. They clapped their hands together and decided that Ryan and I were a perfect fit. At first, I thought someone like Ryan, with his good looks and promising future, would never take a liking to me. But a few days later, my mom came home beaming with excitement, telling me that Ryan actually had feelings for me too. That was when I started getting to know him. Over the next few months, our relationship progressed rapidly. A month ago, our families finalized our engagement. I still remembered how my mom had told me, "A son-in-law like Ryan is a once-in-a-lifetime find. You hit the jackpot, Lena. You better hold on to him tightly, or else I'll make you regret it." To be honest, when I first got together with Ryan, I was dazed, almost in disbelief. I had never imagined I could become his wife. Occasionally, I had noticed him spacing out when he was with me, but I had assumed it was because he was busy with work. It had never occurred to me that even before we were married, he had already been torn between me and Olivia Carter. Maybe he chose me because I was the more suitable option, or maybe it was because both of our families had already decided on us. Now the only thing left between us was that marriage application. Back then, because I was preparing for my college entrance exams, Ryan had asked me to move in early so he could take care of me. But now that I had taken back the marriage application, our relationship had naturally reached its end. Leaving my family home, I felt unusually light, as if a weight had been lifted off my shoulders. For the first time in a while, I had the leisure to take my time. I stopped by a street vendor and bought an ice pop, strolling along at a relaxed pace. At this time, many street vendors were discreetly setting up stalls, selling goods under the guise of private transactions. I knew that in this era, these inconspicuous vendors were the first generation of self-made millionaires. Unfortunately, I had to focus on my studies and could only watch enviously as they paved the way to their future wealth. As I neared home, a sudden scene caught my attention, a man and a woman standing together. "Ryan, no, I can't accept this," Olivia's voice trembled, carrying a hint of suppressed sobs. She sounded incredibly pitiful. Ryan was holding his bicycle with one hand while forcefully stuffing a wad of cash into Olivia's hands with the other. "Just take it. This money would be wasted on unnecessary expenses if I kept it. But for you, it can cover your living costs for half a year. It's better used this way." They were still pushing the money back and forth when Olivia suddenly noticed me. Her face turned pale with shock, and she instinctively stepped in front of Ryan as if shielding him. "There's really nothing going on between us. Don't misunderstand. I was the one shamelessly clinging to him. If you want to blame someone, blame me." The girl in front of me, with her sickly yellow complexion, had an air of fragile determination as if she were ready to sacrifice herself for some great cause. But she didn't see the man she was so desperately protecting, Ryan Sullivan, standing behind her, his face ashen as he stared at me in shock. I adjusted the bracelet I had just bought and walked right past them without sparing them a single glance. What terrible luck, even a simple walk had to be ruined by running into people I didn't want to see. Not long after I returned home, Ryan followed, pushing the door open and stepping inside. For the first time, there was something different in his expression when he looked at me, as if he finally had something to say. "Lena, let me explain." I looked at Ryan Sullivan indifferently. "All right, go ahead." But the truth was, no matter what he said, I wouldn't care. Still, when he saw that I wasn't furious and seemed willing to communicate, he subconsciously let out a breath of relief. "I knew you wouldn't overthink things," he said. I sneered inwardly. He seemed to take a moment to organize his thoughts before speaking in a sincere tone. "Things aren't the way they looked." I watched him silently, making no effort to respond. "There was a time when I got injured," he continued. "On my way to the hospital, I ran into her. She helped me bandage the wound and accompanied me to get treatment." He hesitated for a second before glancing at me cautiously and adding, "After that, every time I went to the hospital to change my bandages, I happened to run into her. Coincidentally, she was a student of my mentor, so I figured I could help her practice a little." Too many coincidences added together were no longer coincidences, they were intentional. I refused to believe that Ryan, as a grown man, wouldn't understand what was really going on. He was just pretending not to see it. So spending that money on jewelry for me would have been a waste, but giving it to her for living expenses was more meaningful. I said, my tone neutral but my words sharp. Ryan's expression stiffened, looking slightly embarrassed. "That's not what I meant." Whether that was what he meant or not, it didn't matter to me. The result was the same. I thought for a moment before speaking earnestly. "Have you ever considered that we could just call off the engagement?" I couldn't help but bring it up. If he was the one to suggest breaking it off, at least my mom wouldn't cry, scream, and threaten to end her life over it. Besides, in our past life, he had grown increasingly distant from me after submitting the marriage application. He probably regretted it back then too. If we could end it now, it would be a relief for both of us. But to my surprise, Ryan's brows furrowed sharply at my words. "Marriage isn't a game. You can't just say you don't want to get married and call it off." His tone was serious. "Lena, that kind of thinking is irresponsible." All right, I get it," I interrupted, raising my hands in surrender. I had no desire to argue with him any further. Without another word, I turned and went back to my room. Rather than waste my time listening to his lectures, I'd rather focus on something productive, like figuring out which stock I should invest in to make a fortune. As for money, I would have to use the funds my parents had given me for the wedding. Because they were so pleased with Ryan, my parents had nearly emptied their life savings to support our marriage. In my past life, they had given me all the dowry money from Ryan's family and even bought a lot of household appliances and furniture for us. Fortunately, I had yet to spend most of that money this time around. I opened my suitcase and carefully took out the dowry money from Ryan's family, wrapping it securely in another cloth. As for the money my parents had given me, I put it away safely. There was no way I could return it now. I'd just consider it my startup capital. If my mom threw a fit about the engagement, I would simply put the money in front of her. Hopefully, the sight of it would be enough to keep her from getting too angry. The plate slipped from her hands, crashing to the floor. Ryan Sullivan rushed out of the kitchen in a panic, but when his eyes met mine, his face instantly turned pale. For a moment, silence hung in the air. Finally, I spoke. "Do you two need me to step out so you can continue your cozy dinner?" Ryan seemed to snap out of his daze and instinctively took a step back. "Lena, you're back." Olivia bit her lip, looking at Ryan with teary eyes before turning to me with an expression of reluctant grievance. I found it amusing. "What, Do I need your permission to come home now? As soon as the words left my mouth, Olivia staggered back 2 steps. Tears streamed down her face as if they cost her nothing, and her lips trembled. Lena, you know that's not what I meant. Before I could reply, Ryan's brows furrowed in frustration. Lena, what are you saying? Olivia is just a student here with no one to take care of her, and since you weren't home, I thought I'd invite her over for dinner. Don't make a fuss over nothing. I glanced at the man standing protectively in front of Olivia. Without hesitation, without a second thought, I slapped him across the face. Ryan froze, stunned. He had clearly never expected me to lay a hand on him. Beyond him, I saw Olivia's lips curl into a faint smirk, her expression carrying a hint of provocation. I let out a cold laugh. Under their gazes, I strode to the table, picked up a pen, and firmly drew the last missing strokes on the tally marks I had been keeping. 2 more days. Just 2 more days, and I would finally be free of these 2 revolting people. After Olivia left, Ryan stared at the marks on the newspaper, finding them strangely unsettling, though he couldn't explain why. Something about them felt off. He turned to me. Lena. Expressionless, I met his gaze. Ryan hesitated before speaking. Olivia and I, there's nothing between us. I had no interest in listening. Picking up my chopsticks, I silently continued my meal. Seeing that I clearly wasn't willing to talk, Ryan fell into silence as well. After dinner, as I was organizing the things I had brought back from my grandmother's house, Ryan suddenly spoke up. By the way, Lena, why does your room look so empty? He frowned slightly. Didn't you have a lot of wedding decorations and preparations? When I didn't respond, a strange look flickered across his face, and for the first time, he seemed vaguely anxious. I was thinking, since our marriage application has already been submitted, we should start decorating the house properly. I saw that you already bought window decorations and stickers before. Bring them to me, and I'll start putting them up. I scoffed. If you want to put them up, go get them from my cousin's place. But to avoid unnecessary arguments with him, I simply said, it's still early. Let's talk about it in a few days. Thinking that I had let the matter go, Ryan Sullivan visibly relaxed. The next morning, I was surprised to find that he had made breakfast. After eating, he didn't leave right away. I ignored him and instead picked up the pen from the table, carefully adding another tally mark. Finally. One last day left. Tomorrow at 6 a.m., I would be able to leave this place for good. Ryan saw me marking the tally and chuckled. Don't worry. The marriage application should be approved soon. I didn't even glance at him. Instead, I started clearing the dishes. Why haven't you left yet? I asked. Ryan smiled at me. Since we're getting married soon, I thought I'd take you shopping for some new clothes. I paused for a moment. His words reminded me, I was about to leave for college. I should buy a few new outfits to start fresh. I went back to my room to get some money. Seeing that I didn't refuse, Ryan let out another small sigh of relief. But in the end, we never bought the clothes. Because the moment we stepped out the door, we saw Olivia Carter leaning against the wall, looking as if she had been waiting there all night. Ryan's face paled as he rushed over and gently nudged her. Olivia slowly opened her eyes, and when she saw the 2 of us together, her expression changed. She instinctively stood up and looked at me. Lena, I'm sorry. Yesterday Before she could finish, her eyes fluttered shut, and she collapsed directly into Ryan's arms. Ryan's expression shifted instantly. Olivia. He caught her and shook her anxiously. I squatted down without a word and pressed my fingers hard against the philtrum point beneath Olivia's nose. She trembled slightly but forced herself not to wake up. I had to admire her dedication. Seeing that I was about to press again, Ryan hesitated, then quickly pulled Olivia away from my hand. She's severely malnourished and anemic. I'll take her to the hospital. Without looking back, he carried her and rushed out the door. I calmly shut the door behind him and slowly followed after them. At the hospital, I watched as Ryan stood anxiously by Olivia's bedside. After the doctor left, when I walked over, he stiffened, then frowned. "Why are you here?" he asked. I looked at Olivia carefully. She wasn't actually that good-looking. Her malnutrition made her appear frail, and her high cheekbones gave her a somewhat sharp, harsh look. Then I looked at Ryan. Maybe this was just his type. Sensing my gaze, Ryan avoided my eyes. I finally spoke, my tone indifferent. "The day you submitted the marriage application, she jumped into the river." The impact of my words was immediate. Olivia's body on the bed trembled violently, and Ryan instinctively shot to his feet. The chair behind him toppled over with a loud crash. He opened his mouth to say something, but I continued, my voice steady. "You used the money meant for my jewelry to help her. When it was for me, you called it a waste. But when it was for her, it was enough to support her for months." Ryan tried to say something, but I raised my hand, stopping him. "It doesn't matter anymore." I glanced at Olivia before speaking again. "While I was away, you brought her into our home. You let her cross that threshold." Ryan opened his mouth, but I lifted my hand again, signaling him to stop. Then I turned to look at the bed. "You knew she was faking it. So are you planning to stay here with her for the night?" I didn't believe for a second that Ryan Sullivan, as a soldier, couldn't tell that Olivia Carter was faking it. This was nothing more than a willing act between the two of them. "If you don't want to get married, you can call off the engagement. But you won't drag me down with you." Ryan finally panicked. "No. I won't break off the engagement." I glanced at Olivia on the bed. Even at this moment, she was still able to keep up the act. Ryan continued speaking, his voice anxious. "I was just trying to help her. She has no family, no one to rely on. She barely has money for food, so I thought I could lend a hand. We're all comrades, we should look out for each other." His voice was slightly raised, as if trying to convince himself. I let out a mocking chuckle and shook my head. "Do whatever you want. I'm leaving." As I reached the door, Ryan's voice sounded from behind me. "Go on ahead. I'll be back soon." Of course, I didn't take his words seriously.